Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. For the second half of tonight's show, I'll be joined by Ash Sarkar. We'll be discussing Donald Trump saying that international law will not restrain him, but don't worry, his morality will. I don't know if you find that reassuring. Also, Keir Starmer has threatened to ban X in the UK over non-consensual indecent images being generated by Grok, which is the AI agent on X, without people's consent. Really, really gross. And obviously Elon Musk being very gross about it. Before that, though, we've got a brilliant interview with Eskandar Sadeghi about the current anti-government protests in Iran and how they fit into the international context. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Demonstrations in Iran appear to be spreading, with protests that began in opposition to rising prices evolving into a movement against the governing regime. There is currently a consensus emerging on right-wing Twitter, if you've been on there, that the mainstream media is refusing to cover these protests. The claim is bizarrely that Western media has this enormous bias in favour of the Ayatollah's regime. I'm not sure what the explanation is supposed to be for that bias. In any case, to put that to bed, here's part of a report from Thursday night on Channel 4 News.
This evening across Iran, thousands responded to the call to take to the streets against the regime. This was Tehran tonight. Internet access was curtailed, so the pictures we've got are limited for now. So these videos are from the last 48 hours, and these protests in Iran are different this time. First of all, they're broader, happening in more places and sometimes in towns you wouldn't expect. A viral moment does not a regime collapse make, but they're coming in thick and fast. Last night in Qaemieh, for example, a statue of General Qasem Soleimani destroyed. Symbols of the powerful Iranian Revolutionary Guard don't come more totemic. This act punishable by death. In Mashhad, the Islamic Republic flag taken down and shredded. Security forces chasing a protester were themselves targeted by the driver of a car and run over.
The protests in Iran have been met with harsh repression. The government has imposed an internet blackout. And according to the US-based human rights activist news agency, at least 50 people have been killed in the violence surrounding protests so far, while more than 2,270 others have been detained. And if we're to take Donald Trump at his word, this could mean a US intervention, like we've seen in Venezuela, is imminent. So last week, Donald Trump posted this on Truth Social. So he said this: if Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, which is their custom, the United States of America will come to their rescue. We are locked and loaded and ready to go. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. That post was made just a day before the Americans kidnapped Nicolas Maduro. And apparently that precedent does have the Iranian government worried. So The Economist has a report saying that the protests at home and the Venezuelan example has Iran's regime rattled. So they say Mr. Maduro's swift downfall has fueled a running debate within Iran's regime. Many officials who were waiting for Mr. Khamenei's death to bring change now want it to come sooner. Things are looking bad enough for the regime to be looking for scapegoats, said an Iranian commentator in exile. Some are considering a Venezuelan-style solution, sacrificing the supreme leader to save the system and stave off chaos. Saeed Lailaz, an economist favoured by the regime, urged the Ayatollah to step aside in favour of a Bonaparte. Now, it's slightly unclear how strong the economist's connections would be inside the Iranian government. I don't think the Ayatollah is particularly close to The Economist magazine, so that should maybe be taken with a pinch of salt. It's not clear also how seriously we should take this commentary from the son of the former Shah of Iran. So Reza Pahlavi has written this week in the Washington Post that Iran is ready for a democratic transition. So he says, in recent days, protests have escalated in nearly all provinces and over 100 cities across Iran. Protesters are chanting my name alongside calls for freedom and national unity. I do not interpret this as an invitation to claim power. I bear it as a profound responsibility. It reflects a recognition inside Iran that our nation needs a unifying figure to help guide a transition away from tyranny and toward a democratic future chosen by the people themselves. I have therefore stepped forward to lead and serve in that capacity, not as a ruler in waiting, but as a steward of a national transition to democracy. Pahlavi says he has been assembling economists and other experts to develop detailed sector-by-sector plans for an orderly transition in Iran, and that he wants to reach out to members of the current regime to avoid state collapse, like was seen after the debarfication policy in Iraq after the US invasion. For his part, Ayatollah Khamenei has tried to dismiss the protesters as the work of outsiders or doing the bidding of outsiders. He told a gathering last night in Tehran, a bunch of rioters destroyed a public building just to please the President of the United States. Iranians must maintain their unity. Let everyone know that the Islamic Republic came to power with the blood of hundreds of thousands of honorable people. Iran will not tolerate mercenaries working in the interests of foreigners. To discuss the situation in Iran, I spoke earlier to Eskandar Sadeghi, lecturer in the International Relations of the Middle East at the School of International Relations at the University of St Andrews.
These protests are obviously highly significant, but they are basically coming off the back of a number of actually protests in the last, several years. Obviously the Islamic Republic there's a long tradition of actually protests against the government and against various policies and so on. But really since 2017, 2018, we have seen very kind of serious cycles of protests, which kind of are often nationwide. They are linked to different kind of various concerns. On the one hand, there are obviously deep sort of socioeconomic kind of grievances. Particularly, there's been a kind of precipitous increase in kind of rural, provincial poverty and broader sort of a massive increase in social inequality more broadly. Another kind of notable protest was 2022, when we had obviously the woman life freedom protests, which very much centered the question of the kind of state-mandated hijab, which obviously was again another nationwide protest, which spread across the country, originated in places like Kurdistan, where we sort of ethnic minorities. And this most recent one, of course, is it's very much combining socioeconomic grievances. It started off in the bazaar and initially sort of electronics vendors, and then the Grand Bazaar in Tehran itself, and then quickly kind of spread actually initially to provincial cities and towns in a very kind of intense fashion, targeting sort of symbols of the regime and so on. And then it sort of last night, it returned back to the capital in a very kind of significant way. And the government does look like it is sort of at a loss of exactly how to tackle it, which we can discuss further if you like.
I suppose I want to get first into this context of the economic problem. So I keep hearing that this sort of started as a protest against economic problems and now seems to be evolving into something more political against the Ayatollah Khamenei and the regime in general. But on the economy, so as far as I understand it, there's a very weak currency, which means that imports are expensive, prices are rising. What's going on here? Why are there economic problems? Is this related to the war with Israel, or is this something separate?
It's all interconnected. There was a 40% kind of depreciation in national currency since the June war. But the kind of depreciation of the currency and it's sort of has been an ongoing issue. It's been one for several years. It really, you could say, started off as far back as 2012 when you sort of had the crippling sanctions imposed by the Obama administration. It then sort of, again, intensified and worsened and was exacerbated during the first Trump term and maximum pressure. And again, I think there's this problem of sort of passing off strictly economic concerns from obviously political ones, because obviously they are profoundly kind of connected. And it's just like, obviously, the sanctions policy can't be entirely separated from sort of its repercussions within the country itself. So creating black markets, exacerbating rentism, really kind of, worsening corruption. And we've seen sort of really skyrocketing inequality in the country as a result. And there's just no doubt that there is a really kind of profound issue of massive corruption and sort of oligarchic control over the country. And the currency is just sort of just one window into that. And because obviously there are multiple exchange rates, that's used by connected organizations and bodies and figures in order to basically make a killing. And often they'll sell it off, or they will buy goods, and then they'll sell them at the market rate and make an absolute kind of killing. And obviously that also has creates sort of inflationary pressures as well. And that's obviously a major concern, as we've seen, sort of over 70% increase in food inflation, over 110% sort of inflation in the cost of bread, which obviously is a staple for many Iranians. And many Iranians just can't, they just can't basically cope. They're just struggling to survive. And that's really the issue. And I think this is where, people have reached the point, of, very much at the end of their tether, as it were. And this is why sort of a seemingly economic crisis can very rapidly spiral into one that is nationwide and highly politicized, because obviously it is also speaking to a deep well of political and social discontent. And the government has shown itself sort of incapable of actually addressing that. And that, it's a really serious issue.
I suppose I'm going to ask a dangerously broad question, which is, how should we characterize the Islamic Republic? Because I suppose what people know and what we often hear in Western media is that this is a repressive government that wants to impose Islamic norms on people, especially women, and everyone will know that it's hostile to Israel. We never really hear about sort of the economic ideology or policy of Iran. What kind of government is it? Is it one that's sort of interested in redistribution? Is it one where it's just trying to export oil and then that circulates amongst the elites? What kind of regime are we looking at here?
I mean, in terms of the political regime, I often describe it as a kind of a theocratic, kind of populist one, insofar as it has, ultimate authority is in sort of the what's called Velayat al-Faqih, the rule of the jurist, who is sort of the appointed deputy of the hidden imam. That's sort of the theocratic basis of it. But obviously you have this other dimension, which is the so-called Republican dimension. Again, these are not democratic institutions. I think these are ways which historically have channeled popular participation in certain ways. Iran has a majlis, it has a parliament, it has obviously an elected president, but obviously there are various kind of mechanisms through which, filters are put in place and only certain people who are approved by these non-elected bodies can stand. So that's sort of the political kind of character of the regime. Economically, it's complex and it's quite messy. So initially, I think the Islamic Republic was very much influenced by broader kind of third world state, I don't say state socialist, but third world kind of populist regimes who did place an emphasis very much on social redistribution. So if you look at sort of certain articles in the Iranian constitution, articles 43 and 44 and so on, you see sort of state ownership over sort of the commanding heights of the economy. You see promises about rights to a roof over your head, to education, all these sorts of things. These are actually social rights which are codified in the constitution. However, the reality of the situation is very, very different. And what you've seen sort of develop, I would say, particularly in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war, is really a kind of a crony capitalist, state capitalist or authoritarian neoliberal regime. And you basically have quasi-state or parastatal organs, such as like these revolutionary foundations, which are basically huge conglomerates, which have huge resources at their disposal. And often these are used to kind of dispense and dole out kind of patronage. And obviously by virtue of their proximity, to power, and they are really part of the state, the wider state, they use that to engage in all sorts of activities like rentierism, as I was talking about. And, so what we see really is a hollowing out of a lot of the social provisions, which you could argue characterize maybe the first decade of the Islamic Republic, which even that should be qualified because that was under conditions of basically, the war with Iraq. So we see a kind of a military sort of Keynesian system there. But basically what we've seen since the 90s, I would say, is a authoritarian neoliberal system, really, which is increasing, as I said, basically put increased pressure on sort of social provision. Healthcare is profoundly privatized. Education is increasingly privatized. And this is why people are, very much disgruntled. It's not one that it's not a system that's actually working for the common good. And it's not just because it's not democratic, it's because it's very much stilted and geared to enriching people who are either politically connected or those who are able to kind of bribe those and sort of ingratiate themselves to those in power.
What do we know about what the people protesting at the moment want? Because I suppose with the Masha Amini protests in 2022, it was quite easy really to understand what was going on. There'd been a woman who was arrested for supposedly not having her hijab on correctly, who dies in custody, and then there were protests, against religious repression, the repression of women. And I understand actually that was potentially somewhat successful in the sense that the Iranian regime has now stopped being or given a bit more space to, I suppose, personal expression. Two questions there. You can tell me if that is correct. But then also my secondary question is, what is the political nature of these protests at the moment? Are we even in a position to know?
So I would say that, the Mahsa Amini or Jina uprising of 2021 did have, there are visible impacts on the ground. And you could argue that the government has made, you could say, tactical, I would say, concessions. And the reason for that is that they are very worried about basically antagonizing half the population more than necessary, because that could then again provoke exactly the kind of social unrest that we're seeing at the moment. So I would say they have made concessions. It's very common now to see women walking around major cities and towns without the hijab. I mean, this is a huge kind of, I would say, gain. There's also been some sort of relaxation in terms of political discussion, again, like relatively speaking. So I think these are of note, but obviously it's because the regime is so profoundly vulnerable. That's why they are making these concessions. You could imagine if they were able to claw back sort of significant kind of power again, that they would try to reverse those very quickly. And still today, I mean, there are moments when all of a sudden the question of mandatory hijab will become very much kind of will be circulating amongst the political elites, and certain elites will be saying we need to kind of enforce this again. So that is kind of one thing. But I think it is a really notable kind of bottom-up sort of gain, which people did kind of take through struggle. And so what was and the current protests? In terms of the current protests, I mean, it's very difficult, to gauge, because what we've seen largely, as I said, is this movement from the bazaar to provincial kind of protests and unrest. Some of that has been, taken kind of a violent turn in some instances. And of course, the government itself has repressed it very violently as well. And we know up to about 40 casualties thus far, maybe 2,000 people have been arrested. So it is a very serious kind of situation. In Tehran yesterday, there was, again, a very significant sort of mobilization, I would say. And in those, we heard a variety of slogans. Some of them were calling for freedom. Some were saying death to the dictator. Others were like openly pro, monarchy. So they were saying, long live the Shah. Many were sort of saying, one of the quite notable slogans was saying, this is kind of the last battle. The Pahlavis will return. So there's quite a mix. And I would say the protests at the minute do sort of cut across various different social classes. So obviously you see really kind of the very poor in the provinces in many instances. And then in places like Tehran, you have seen sort of middle class mobilization, but not only middle class, actually. I mean, I was seeing protests yesterday in sort of poorer districts like Naziabad as well. So that, again, is very much a cross-class sort of series of protests, and they have different demands. And I think the thing that we have to be wary of, and it's always an issue with these protests, we will have people who will be ventriloquizing for the Iranian population and be saying, Iranians want this, Iranians want that. And I think the second we start hearing that, we have to be kind of wary. I don't think there's any doubt that Iranians want a more democratic, a more responsive, a more competent, and better kind of government, which kind of works for, towards the common good and the benefit of all, of course. But what shape that would take, what configuration, what constitutional figuration it might take, is still very much up in the air. And to be honest, we don't even know whether these protests are going to be brutally repressed and sort of scattered to the wind. Which, again, I don't think it would solve the issue. It might just kick the can down the road until the next cycle. But, that's very much an option that is on the table. And given Ayatollah Khamenei's most recent speech, that he just gave, it seems, he's looking to be very much intransigent and just quash it.
In these situations, there's always two questions, isn't there? Which is, what do protesters want? And then if they are successful, what will they get? And I mean, obviously, your knowledge of Iranian history is much richer than mine. But my pop version of history of, say, 1979 is you have the dictatorship of the Shah, which is fairly repressive. You have an uprising, and a big player in that uprising are people who want a more leftish, liberal, democratic system. But once the Shah is on the rocks, it turns out that the only people with the power, the influence, the muscle to take over the country are the Islamists, which isn't what many of those more liberal protesters would have wanted. Maybe that's a very ham-fisted history of Iran, but the point may still hold. And I suppose now, even if those people protesting in Iran are people who want a more democratic system, want a more liberal system, maybe a more social democratic system, if this regime falls, that's not necessarily what they're going to get, and they could get something worse. So I suppose, could you speak to that? If it were the case, as some people are suggesting, this is a revolution, the Islamic Republic is going to fall, who would be in a position to take the reins in Iran?
I mean, I think it is a very kind of significant uprising, but I think the point that you raise is the really obviously important one. I mean, for quite a while, actually, the whole idea that Iran could be, even this term was very widespread actually in a lot of the discussions in Persian. So Syrianization, so like the Syrianization of Iran, that you could have this sort of breakdown, state collapse, sort of entry into civil war. And that was, there was a genuine prospect, but obviously many other people saw it as a scarecrow. They saw it as a way of actually shutting down real political contestation. And as we can see, I mean, we just had a war like 6 months ago where Iran was attacked by Israel and the United States. And that fear hasn't been sufficient to stop people from going into the street, which tells you just how desperate and angry they must be. So I think that needs to be borne in mind. But then obviously, like you said, I mean, what the future holds. I mean, there are multiple kind of scenarios. I mean, one is kind of a state breakdown and civil war, which I don't think is on the cards at the minute. Obviously, Iran doesn't have the same sort of sectarian kind of composition issues that you might find in Iraq or in Syria. But you could imagine certainly kind of ethnic and nationalist kind of conflict of some description or another. You could imagine potentially the Revolutionary Guards transforming in some way, and actually, if a civil war to break out, very much push forward its own agenda in that continent. It would be very well placed, obviously, to do that. But then we might actually be getting ahead of ourselves. I mean, other plausible scenarios, I think that actually the case of Venezuela is quite instructive, whereby you could imagine a context whereby people within the regime maybe sideline Ayatollah Khamenei and people around him, and then try to potentially put a new sort of face on the regime. It could be a military individual, which again, I don't really think there are any sort of standout candidates for this, but you never know. Or it could be someone else within the political elite who could rally people within the elite to back them. Again, there's no candidates which look to be able to do that at the minute, but it's a possible one. But the real problem, I think, at the moment is that the government just is both ineffective and it's clearly unable to govern in a way which is going to placate people in a sort of enduring sort of way. So we have multiple kind of scenarios. I mean, I think we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves because we really just don't know whether these protests will continue to spiral, continue to basically persist and grow and reach a critical mass. That's the really crucial thing. So we should probably not preempt that. I mean, there's scenarios is like civil breakdown versus sort of a coup or a kind of Bonapartist sort of solution. These are things which could happen later down the line. But yeah, we aren't there. And of course, the other option is sort of Reza Pahlavi, the former crown prince of the country, who I think the Israelis are very much backing. I mean, he pretty much went to Israel and pledged more or less fealty to Netanyahu. And I think he is sort of lobbying to try and actually engage Trump directly. Trump so far has been quite dismissive. And I think, the Americans, just like they did in Venezuela, if they are looking to back someone, they'll probably back somebody who can sort of do a deal with the United States, ensure stability, and probably ensure access to Iran's, natural resources and wealth in some respect. That seems like also probably a much more likely scenario than Reza Pahlavi swooping in and then taking over and sort of reestablishing the Pahlavi monarchy.
Yeah, so the Venezuela example sort of shows that they don't necessarily want a wild card. They want an insider with a different name. That seems to have been all that's really happened in Venezuela. The Venezuelan example, so people are looking at this as sort of a precedent. Will we see something in Iran, like that which we saw in Venezuela. You mentioned there, maybe there will be insiders in the regime who decide, the way to keep this whole thing intact is to sideline the sort of the figurehead. There is also a suggestion that the situation in Venezuela could have a more direct impact on Iran. So I want to show you a clip of British MP Tom Tugendhat speaking to Andrew Marr on LBC, and then get your thoughts on what he said.
Tom, when we started, I said that I thought that what's going on in Iran could yet prove to be a bigger story than any of this. And I've noticed you've been posting on social media about it. Just your reflections. Donald Trump did say that if the regime in Iran carried on killing protesters, he would intervene. They have carried on killing protesters, but perhaps his attention is currently elsewhere.
Well, I'm not sure you're right, actually, Andrew. He has intervened. He's intervened by removing the head of state of the country that was doing all the financial transfers and quite a lot of the weapons building for the Islamic Republic. And I refer, of course, to Venezuela. The bit that we're missing in this Venezuela story is Venezuela is an integral part of the Islamic regime's ability to coordinate terrorist groups like Hezbollah, or to build ballistic missiles, or to build drones.
Sorry, Tom, I'm so sorry. Just explain to me why that's the case.
So, as you may be aware, the Islamic regime in Iran has always had a problem with sanctions ever since the 1979 revolution. In fact, particularly since Operation Eagle Claw, when the Americans tried and failed to rescue those hostages in the US embassy. I think it was about 100 hostages. Forgive me, I'm going to get the number wrong. And the Americans imposed sanctions on Iran at the time, financial sanctions, and then other sanctions have grown up. Well, one of the ways that the Iranian government has got round those sanctions, or tried to get round those sanctions anyway, is by using shadow banking facilities through countries like Venezuela. Now, over the years, many of the others have dropped away. Syria, for example, has dropped away. Countries in the Middle East have stopped cooperating. But one country that continued to cooperate right up until the 3rd of January, and probably is still cooperating a bit even now, is Venezuela. So what we've seen out of Venezuela is we've seen drugs carried by Hezbollah taken across into Liberia, Sierra Leone, and then up into Europe as a way of making money. We've seen weapons parts designed in Iran, built in Venezuela, then smuggled through some of this shadow fleet back into Iran, assembled into ballistic missiles, sent over into Russia, fired over to kill Ukrainians, and indeed some of them have crossed the border into Poland. So we're seeing actually already action against the Iranian regime. We just don't recognize it, because Venezuela is a key player in the Iranian regime's government of terror and global network.
Now, I wanted to know what you thought of that, Eskandar. I mean, Tom Tugendhat, a fairly hawkish politician, he's known as that. I suppose when it comes to Venezuela, I think everyone understands how the fall of Maduro could be very bad for Cuba, because Venezuela has historically and up to the present day provided Cuba with lots of oil, in part in exchange for their doctors. And the like, and that one thing it seems like might change in Venezuela, even though most of the regime is staying intact, is that Donald Trump might force a change in Venezuela's foreign policy. I hadn't heard quite as much about the fall of Maduro being a big economic problem for Iran. I don't know if you think what Tom Tugendhat said there made sense, or if you think he's getting a bit sort of carried away, as it were.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the latter. He seems that he is getting a bit carried away. I mean, the really crucial, obviously, powers that would really impact Iran very, very significantly, of course, are Russia, who, there's quite significant, obviously, security and military cooperation with Russia, of course, is notable. And that is obviously relates to Ukraine, but it relates more broadly. Just like you can imagine, like the Russian-Syrian, with the Assad regime, sort of their relationship was obviously very kind of significant. But I think China obviously is the most important one. I mean, by a long shot, because obviously China buys as much as sort of 90% of Iran's oil and gas, right? So, and this is because obviously Iran really struggles to sell, or exactly because of US sanctions and secondary sanctions. So, I mean, yeah, if basically Xi's China fell and turned into a very kind of pro-Western regime, then I think Iran would be in really, really deep kind of trouble. But because Iran has become increasingly kind of dependent for revenues from China, and obviously, I mean, part of its, Iran's issue is really, it is struggling for revenue. And this is why it's actually increasingly kind of imposed sort of austerity measures, which have then in turn generated a lot of social discontent. So, I mean, I don't think Venezuela is, I'm sure there was significant cooperation that goes back to, at least to, I mean, I can remember the Ahmadinejad and Chavez period where that really did kind of increase. And it was sort of this sort of, I guess, axis of powers that were very much opposed to American hegemony, right? So there was significant kind of political and diplomatic support, but I don't think it's going to be really decisive economically. As I said, I think Russia and China are far, far more important in that respect.
I didn't find it that persuasive, because the reason Venezuela is very helpful to Cuba is because they've got oil and Cuba doesn't have oil, and obviously they're quite close to each other. Sort of Iran has the one thing that Venezuela can export. So I didn't find it that convincing. Let's end on Israel. Obviously, there are lots of people in Israel, in the Israeli government, who want complete regime change in Iran. Potentially, they want complete state collapse in Iran. Are they going to be licking their lips, looking at these protests? And do you see them sort of making a decision that now is the time to strike again?
Well, I mean, undoubtedly they're going to be licking their lips. I mean, I should have really probably said this earlier. I'm sure there are plenty of, intelligence assets on the ground right now in Iran. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt there. I mean, if anyone doubted that, we'd have to look to the June 12-day war, whereby, we saw what the Israelis managed to do, sort of mobilizing various teams to take out Iran's air defense systems in order to undertake sort of assassinations, unleash drones, so on and so forth, and significant levels of sabotage. So I'm sure that is going on now. They probably didn't burn. I mean, very unlikely that they actually used or burned all of their assets in the June war. So I'm sure that will be happening. They certainly will be licking their lips. I mean, I don't think we're going to see any strikes, because exactly that would be very much to the detriment of the protesters. And of course, the Israelis do want to see these snowball, and they will want to take advantage of the situation. I guess what we need to watch out for is if the Iranian government really does partake, as is its wont, in massive violence and repression. They might actually use that situation in order to sort of undertake either targeted strikes or to some sort of action to actually, to engender a situation of civil conflict. I mean, that is very much kind of a possibility. And of course, then the onus is on the Iranian government to either de-escalate or actually make, sufficient political and economic concessions so that point isn't reached. But yeah, of course, I mean, foreign powers are going to seek to take advantage of this. But at the same time, the Islamic Republic has for decades now sort of just blamed, foreign powers for every single protest that ever takes place in Iran in a profoundly kind of cynical and disingenuous way. So they obviously bear a huge amount of responsibility for bringing us to this point as well.
In a wide-ranging interview with the New York Times, Donald Trump has said international law will not restrain him. But don't worry, something else will.
Do you see any checks on your power on the world stage? Is there anything that could stop you if you wanted to?
Yeah, there's one thing, my own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop. And that's law. Very good. I don't need international law. I'm not looking to hurt people.
Ash, welcome to the show. Governing the relationships between nation states, we could either have international law or we could have Donald Trump's morality. Which would you prefer?
So on the one hand, we have international law, not perfect, obviously. The mechanisms for enforcing it, very weak, particularly when it comes to great powers. And on the other hand, we have the clearly flawless morality of a man who's been found liable for the sexual assault of E. Jean Carroll, who has been tied up in, I think, hundreds of lawsuits by contractors that he failed to pay. A former friend of Jeffrey Epstein, who may have sent a lewd birthday card with, kind of the outline of a naked woman. Someone who calls female reporters piggy when he wants them to shut up. Somebody who has authorized the kidnapping of a president in the region, in Nicolas Maduro. Somebody who has no regard for the sovereignty of other states. I don't know, man. I think we should give this Donald Trump morality a try, seeing as we're in the era where, international law has seemingly come to an end.
Let's listen to a bit more of that exchange.
Do you feel your administration needs to abide by international law on the global stage?
Yeah, I do. I do. But it depends what your definition of international law is. You mean in Greenland?
In Greenland,
that's because you needed them at the time.
In the 1951 agreement, though, it says the United States can reopen these bases anytime you want. You can send as many troops as you want, and you haven't done it. How come?
Because I want to do it properly.
And properly means own it?
Really, it is. To me, it's ownership. Ownership is very important.
Why is ownership important here?
Because it's what I feel is psychologically needed for success. I think that ownership gives you a thing that you can't do, whether you're talking about a lease or a treaty. Ownership gives you things and elements that you can't get from just signing a document that you can have a base.
So we could go into the psychology of this. Donald Trump saying he just really wants to own it, even if sort of all the functions of security could be achieved without owning it. He's just in this island and he wants it to be his. I suppose on a more serious level, though, on a more sort of significant level, is this a real shift in how America exercises power? Because I suppose one way that you could distinguish the American empire from, say, the British Empire or the French Empire or even the Roman Empire is that those were all empires where, the core wanted to have direct governing control over the peripheries. And the United States has seemed to be able to maintain what many people would call an empire without doing that. Obviously, if you go too far in a certain direction, you might get cooed by the United States. But to be sort of within America's sphere of influence, they've normally allowed countries to be relatively independent, right? To be sovereign nation states, not just part of the American government system. Or I think you can argue that Europe is within America's empire, but we're not owned by America. But now we seem to be going back to something a bit more like the British Empire, where Donald Trump looks at a country and says, I want to govern that country.
I don't know if you've seen this theory from Adam Tooze, which is, half in jest, but also might not be, which is this idea that maybe Donald Trump's theory of geopolitics has been generated from playing Risk. Because if you play Risk, I think as North America, you have to have control of Venezuela, Canada, and Greenland in order to win. And so those are clearly all things that he said he wants to do. Sort of floated this idea of annexing Canada, wants to either purchase or invade Greenland, maybe, and has already cooed Maduro and has said he wants control of the oil. So that's something which you can't exactly dismiss. I mean, I wrote about this in this morning's Cortado, which I know you are an avid reader of, Michael, where I was trying to get to grips with what is genuinely new about Trump's doctrine and what is kind of old and a continuation. And I think that what we've seen, particularly in this past week, is what you get when you sort of marry the ineffable idiosyncrasies of Donald Trump as a personality with some long-standing strategic objectives of quite established neoconservatives. So, for instance, the kidnapping of Maduro, that has been a long-standing objective of neocons. Why does Trump do it at the time that he does it? There are all sorts of takes on why. One is the idea that he thought that Maduro wasn't taking negotiations seriously enough. Another is that he just always wanted to do it and it happened to be now. Another is that it would take attention away from the Epstein list, whatever, right? But what you have there is like quite a long-standing objective coupled with something that's gone in Donald Trump's brain that we probably will never fully understand. I think when it comes to Greenland and saying, okay, well, it may be a choice between preserving, the NATO alliance or me having this thing that I want, that is something that's fairly new, and I'll tell you why. America has always been selective about what international treaties it does or does not sign up to or ratify. I mean, I cited the Rome Statute, which establishes the International Criminal Court and its jurisdiction. America has never been a signatory to the Rome Statute. That's something which is quite long-standing, and that's sort of, America's relationship to international law in a nutshell. We want it to bind other countries, but not us. What's a little bit different about Donald Trump, and you saw this with the unilateral exit from the Iranian nuclear deal in 2018, is that I think he considers any kind of agreement before a profound show of force to be essentially chickening out, right? Why do we sign up to this? It's a bad deal, could have gotten a better deal. There's always more to squeeze them. So I think that his preference is for negotiations and deal making to take place after he's had the chance to throttle the person or the party that's sat opposite at the negotiating table. And I kind of think that that's maybe where Greenland sits. Is Donald Trump willing to completely implode NATO? Maybe part of his judgment is that, well, actually European powers need to be sort of underpinned and undergirded by American military might more than they need, Denmark to be within the fraternity of nations. That might be a part of the calculation he's making. Or he's thinking, all right, there's a show of force and then I get some kind of sweetheart deal on minerals, right? That might be a thing that he's thinking. But I do think that is something which is sort of genuinely new in the sort of like evolution of, American geopolitics, is this thing which I think is an aspect of Trump and sort of comes from his experience in business, which is first I'll choke you and then we'll talk.
And I wanted to talk about the broader issue of international law. So Donald Trump there saying, well, I mean, he does later in the interview, in that clip we showed you, sort of say, oh, actually, I do follow international law. It just depends on your definition, which obviously just leaves it very open. I suppose the definition being he agrees with it when he follows international law, when he agrees with it, and he doesn't when he doesn't. This whole thing, so I suppose starting with the kidnapping of Maduro, has sparked, I think, quite an interesting debate about international law, whether it matters. There's obviously for a long time been a critique on the left and also the right, sort of a realist critique it would be called, whereby international law is basically just seen as fairly meaningless, as a tool for imperialism, as ideology, essentially, whereby strong states, I suppose, hide the imperial nature of their relationships with other states behind liberal niceties. And so some people look at Donald Trump and they say, look, there isn't actually anything new here beyond finally there's a president who's honest about what they're doing. So the argument would be that many presidents would have behaved in a very similar way to Donald Trump, but they would just have dressed up their motives in a different way. They wouldn't have explicitly said this is about oil or because I want to own that island. They would have said it's because of democracy, et cetera, et cetera. They would have tried to fit it within liberal norms. As I say, this has prompted, I think, an interesting debate this week. I want to show one tweet that got quite a lot of traction from economist and writer Dominic Lersder. I hope I've pronounced his second name correctly. He tweets under the name New Left E-Views. So he said, the argument against international law on the basis that it is hard to enforce and a vehicle for great power interests is superficially plausible, but intellectually bankrupt. There is a collective virtue in hypocrisy if it involves us forcing each other to use a language with which we can try to create accountability in the long run and which is necessary to organise opposition before and after the fact. It is an important basis for winning power and thus for social transformation in general. The world that is emerging now is just the kind of world you get when you insist on vulgar realism. On the left, it is indicative of us not having any serious theory of geopolitics. Ash, I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Obviously, we've been talking about international law a lot in the context of Gaza. You did a long interview with Kenneth Roth last year on the topic of international law. Do you think for all that people on the left have criticised international law, we might miss it when it's completely gone, so it's already not as strong as people might like to make out. Major powers get to choose as and when they follow it. But if we end up now with a generation of politicians who just say, screw it, I'm doing this because I want to, are we going to miss the days when they used to at least have to come up with a justification for what they do?
Do you know something, Michael? I was looking through today's script and I saw this question and I was like, bloody hell, it's like such a deep question about political philosophy. And the most honest answer I can give you is I'm not entirely sure what I think. I'm, like lots of other people, trying to work out what I think. And I can give you sort of the coordinates of the different starting points which exist in my brain, but I don't think I've got a conclusion where I can say definitively, yes, international law is an important fiction and it's something to which we aspire, and it becomes a language through which politics is contested in a useful way. Or no, it was a way of sort of obscuring the extractive and oppressive relationships between the global north and the global south. I don't know what I think definitively either side, so that might be very disappointing for people. I mean, in terms of like describing where we are now, I was doing a little bit of research in order to prepare for answering this question, and I found a really interesting article by a guy called Nicholas Rakovich, and one of the things that he says in his description of this period that we seem to have entered is that it's the rule of guns and lawyers. And there is this fantastic quote from his piece where he says, international law has not vanished, but it no longer sets the limits of great power conduct. It is being displaced by legality, rules as instruments, not restraints. So this thing about legality rather than a restraint, and the rule of guns and lawyers, it's sort of like trying to tie up your opponent in lawsuits and legalism. So it's an instrument by which you gain an advantage or impose a disadvantage, but it's not actually a moral framework at all. And I think that once more describes Trump's approach to politics very, very well. In terms of whether or not you're going to entirely throw out international law, I mean, look, I think that there has been some ways in which international law has been a useful and impactful framework. I think that its impact on conventional weaponry in warfare, with some exceptions, has been transformational. So you think about things like, landmines and use of poison gas and biological agents and things like that. International law has been hugely, hugely impactful. I think maybe the thing that's missed out by, it's a virtuous hypocrisy, right? It gives us a framework for accountability. Is that one of the things that it perhaps misses out is the sort of material conditions in which this language game takes place. And I think that this is something which is missed out by lots of people. So what are the constraints on American power after the Cold War? What were the constraints on Russian power after the Cold War? These are things which really matter for when you're thinking about what are these countries going to do and why. I think that there's another part of the picture which is really important, which is, we talked about it in our end of year roundup, myself and our colleague Aaron Bastani, which is this really uneven model of nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear disarmament. So countries like Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons on the understanding that there would be certain security guarantees. What guarantees existed clearly were not enough to prevent Russia invading Ukrainian sovereign territory. And I think that there are arguments in favour of the idea that, okay, well, if Ukraine had never given up its nuclear stockpile, maybe you wouldn't have seen the invasion by Russia. There are certainly people in Iran who will be thinking, well, Israel and America would never have attacked us if we actually had the bomb. And maybe those years sort of, slowing down the process of uranium enrichment and, playing nice by signing up to this treaty, what that did was stop us from developing this capability, which is really essential to our survival as a nation. So I think that international law is a means of accountability and a means of contesting politics. It doesn't exist separately from those conditions. So I'm not advocating a sort of vulgar realism, but a little bit of vulgar realism maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dominic Lasda, from following him on Twitter, would probably say he also takes into account the material power dynamics. But obviously, you're commenting on this particular tweet. The thing that stood out to me that I liked about this, and this is something I've been thinking about in many contexts, is how hypocrisy is not the worst thing in the world. Because hypocrisy in some ways is, obviously this be a very idealistic way of talking about international relations, but on an individual level, it's sometimes you trying to hold yourself to a higher standard than which is actually possible. And I think one reason why it's the right-wing tabloids that are so obsessed with hypocrisy, a climate campaigner who then takes a plane, or, someone who's against animal cruelty and then eats a burger, all this stuff. And it's not because they want people to hold themselves to the highest standards. It's because the alternative is a kind of moral nihilism where you just say, well, you should just be able to do what you want. And if people just do exactly what they want, then might makes right. So I think the opposite of hypocrisy isn't necessarily moral purity. It's like amoralism. And I think that applies to many parts of life and politics. I don't know, your final thoughts on that, Ash, before we move to our final story?
Sometimes I feel like we're two horses in one harness, Michael, because as you were talking, before you said the thing about, right-wing commentators, I wrote down hypocrisy is a charge you can only level at people who are trying to do something. Because this is something which I have been thinking for a long time, which is why is it hypocrisy is the preferred charge offered by, Julia Hartley-Brewer on one side or Piers Morgan on the other. It's because it's something which you can only throw at someone who is aspiring to be better than they are or trying to make the world better than it currently is. You can only level it as a charge against people who are trying to do something that they see in some way as good. And I think that the charge of hypocrisy, it's coming from an emotional place that I think we all have, but is like kind of a bad one, where someone trying to do something sort of throws our own inadequacy or lack of moral backbone or integrity into sharp relief. And so rather than being put in touch with, well, actually, could I be doing more than I currently am, and having an interrogative relationship to that feeling, instead you sort of do the Uno reverse back to you and be like, oh, you make me feel shit about myself here. Let me make you feel shit by calling you a hypocrite.
Ofcom, the UK media regulator, has been urged to use all its powers against X, formerly Twitter, over concerns about unlawful AI images created on the site. The powers that Ofcom has could in theory include a complete ban on the Elon Musk-owned platform. The move follows a pretty disturbing trend on X where users have been asking the platform's AI agent called Grok to generate undressed images, especially of women, without their consent. Now, I don't want to just show you a whole bunch of, there are literally thousands of these. If you click on sort of Grok and look at the images, it just seems to have been spending the last 2 weeks just purely undressing people against their consent. And I don't want to show you reels of that. This was one example I thought was probably most acceptable to show because it was someone who shared the AI image of herself. So Beth Eleanor is a novelist who shared this photo of her standing next to a promotional image for her new book. A user then asked Grok to undress her. And then, again, it's obviously not her real naked body, but we've blurred it anyway, just out of respect, because it was made without her consent. But she has shared this image with the statement, "When will the AI images of me end? It's non-stop all day under my book promotions. Elon Musk, is there any plans to monitor non-consensual AI undressing?" In the last couple of weeks, this has been happening, as I say, thousands and thousands of times. Elon Musk has done nothing to stop it. Daisy Dixon is a UK-based academic who was also digitally undressed.
That's when I started getting a lot of seeing in the replies, various users asking Grok to put me in a bikini, put me in various revealing sort of lingerie and things like that. And then I started noticing that they were beginning to alter and manipulate parts of my body, so decrease parts of me and increase other parts of my body in a highly sexualized way.
And how did that make you feel?
When I first saw them, I was really shocked and I felt frightened. Even though I was in the safety of my own home, I felt unsafe. But more so, it was a kind of alienating experience because when you're looking at these images, because they have this quality of being transparent, they're like photographs. They have such a strong sense of realism about them. So you're looking at yourself, but it's not you. And someone has taken your body against your will and controlled it and manipulated it. And that's just, it creates this really jarring, like, conceptual and mental state. It's me, but it's not me. And it's just, yeah, it's horrible.
You reported it to X. What happened?
I've reported a few of them. I stopped looking for them, to be honest. They were appearing more and more in my replies. So I started reporting some, and within minutes, X would reply and say there'd been no violation of X rules.
No violation of X rules. And, this was being pointed out to Elon Musk, and basically all he was doing is he was, quote tweeting an image where someone had asked it to make a picture of him in a bikini, sort of like, I can take a joke. Why can't all of these women being undressed take a joke? The one thing he did say should stop is Grok undressing children, or digitally undressing children. This is a tweet from Samantha Smith. So she says, 40 hours later and paedophiles are still using Grok to undress literal children. So sort of there's a picture of a child and then people asking to put her in a bikini. According to CNN, the digital undressing of people, including children, came after a push by Elon Musk to remove Grok's guardrails. So this is from that CNN report. According to one source with knowledge of the situation at XAI, Musk has been unhappy about over-censoring on Grok for a long time. A second source with knowledge of the situation at X said staffers consistently raised concerns internally and to Musk about overall inappropriate content created by Grok. At one meeting in recent weeks, before the latest controversy erupted, Musk held a meeting with XAI staffers from various teams where he was really unhappy over restrictions on Grok's Imagine image and video generator. The first source with knowledge of the situation at XAI said. So he specifically said, there are too many guardrails. Well, why are we censoring people on this? Da, 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 da. And then lo and behold, you have all of these women on Twitter who creepy men are asking for them to be sort of made to look as if they're wearing a bikini. And Keir Starmer has spoken out strongly against Musk's platform, telling Greatest Hits Radio this.
It's disgraceful. It's disgusting. And it's not to be tolerated. X has got to get a grip of this. And Ofcom have at full support to take action in relation to this. This is wrong. It's unlawful. We're not going to tolerate it. I've asked for all options to be on the table. It's disgusting. And X need to get their act together and get this material down. And we will take action on this because it's simply not tolerable.
I'm not sure if it's because he found Keir Starmer's indignation there threatening or for another reason, but earlier today, and in response to this sort of really broad outcry, X changed their policy with regard to making AI-generated images. And yes, this is the bold move from Elon Musk. The right to digitally undress women on the app will now only be available for those with an X subscription, i.e. people who are paying Elon Musk about $10 a month. Ash, I'm sure you have a more difficult time on X than I do. We've seen thousands and thousands of women be digitally undressed. I think really humiliating, really disgusting, really intimidating. Elon Musk's response is to not ban it, but just make people pay to do it. So now if you want to undress if you want to undress a woman against her will, you just have to pay him a tenner.
So the first thing is that I think that part of Elon Musk's project of taking over Twitter and turning it into X was that he wanted to take a platform that had been associated with liberals and the left and becoming a space in which left-wing ideas could do well and be promoted quite far, is that he wanted to render the app unusable for those groups of people. So when you see the weakening of content moderation, basically the eradication of content moderation on X, the kind of racist abuse, and I'm talking about things like the N-word and, out and out slurs. Not only did it absolutely proliferate, but even when you report those tweets, they don't get taken down. And that has a psychological effect when you read that kind of abuse. I use the app a lot less than I would have because it's a choice between that or going insane. And I think that when you consider the entirely predictable outcome of what happens when you allow an AI to generate, semi-nude, highly sexualized images of real people. Of course, that's going to be used for the purposes of non-consensual sexualization, violation, and humiliation. I think because, I think Elon Musk hates, anyone who he would consider a woke warrior. So, people of color who are anti-racist, women who are feminists. This is part of making the app unusable for those groups of people. So I don't think it's a byproduct. I don't think it's an accident. I think it's a design feature, not a flaw as such. It's funny, I have been wanting to say something about this for a while, and the reason why I haven't is because I was scared that people would start doing this to images of me. I've had images of me, in a bikini shared in a disparaging way on X. I had images taken of me on holiday, just like kind of like fun, normal photos, uploaded to porn websites and had to get them taken down. I've seen like really horrific and racist rape fantasies distributed on Reddit. And so unfortunately, this has been something that I've had to try and make sense of. And I think that there's a variety of reasons of why people do this. One is that I do think that the absolute explosion of online pornography and the fact that the user experience, so the sort of like design of like porn websites and porn apps and how much they resemble sort of, PG social media apps. So the way in which Pornhub resembles YouTube and OnlyFans resembles Instagram. I think one of the downstream effects of this is that it's sort of placed all women who have their image on the internet in some way in this kind of proximity to or conversation with porn. So people treat you like porn, even though that's not your job. Something that happens on Instagram a lot is that people DM me asking if I'll send them, nude photos of myself or pictures of my feet, and that they're willing to pay for it. And I'm just like, that's not my job. Like, that's not my job. And I do think that there is a sort of like moral curdling that's happened because of the proliferation of online porn and the sort of expectations of the sets of women. I think that's one really important part of the conversation. The other part is that humiliation is eroticized. I think if you are a person who derives part of their sense of self, has a sense of purpose or mission through like taking down, in particular, people who you consider to be political opponents who are of the gender to whom you are attracted, there is a sort of eroticization of that humiliation. And then there is just something which is age-old, which is knowing, regardless of whether or not you derive an erotic thrill from something, whether or not you find it sexually exciting, that you can use sexuality to demean and humiliate and violate women. Right, that women will experience an intense sense of violation if you use sex and sexuality as the means by which to attack them. So it's really depressing. What's the answer to it? What's the solution to it? I mean, unfortunately, that does have to be greater state regulation, and I think some kind of consequence for platforms which allow this kind of, let's face it, it's a form of digital sexual assault to take place. I don't like it from a free speech perspective, but I think that when you have an AI where the guardrails have been removed so that you can use it specifically to produce non-consensual sexual images of real people, that has to be treated as a form of facilitation of a sex crime, because it is a sex crime.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Lots of people in the comments, saying solidarity with you as well. I mean, I'm sorry you have to go through so much of that. I mean, I see it on your X. It's disgusting. Back to this element of what Keir Starmer will do and whether he has the power to properly regulate this or even ban it. I wanted to bring up a tweet from a American congressperson. So she's Anna Paulina Luna, responded to stories about a potential X ban in the UK with a threat. So she said this: "If Starmer is successful in banning X in Britain, I will move forward with legislation that is currently being drafted to sanction not only Starmer, but Britain as a whole. This would mirror actions previously taken by the United States in response to foreign governments restricting the platform, including the dispute with Brazil in 2024 to 2025, which resulted in tariffs, visa revocations, and sanctions and consequences tied to free speech concerns against Brazilian officials over concerns related to censorship and free speech violations. Starmer should consider this course of action, or there will be consequences." And Ash, I mean, I think there is a big story here, which is, I mean, what we've been talking about already is a big story, but a geopolitical story almost, because I do think that Musk owning Twitter has been a big political factor in the destabilization of Europe, frankly, because it has really, really given rocket boosters to the far right. Elon Musk has used it and tweaked the algorithm to attack any kind of centre-left or centrist politician he doesn't like. I think it has been. I think that the Labour government probably wouldn't be quite as unpopular as it was if it weren't for X. So it matters to European politicians. But it is I mean, this is just one congressperson, of course, but you can imagine a European leader trying to regulate X somehow. And if Donald Trump or one of his allies are in the White House, them literally sanctioning that European country, it doesn't seem beyond the realms of possibility. And that is, I mean, that's geopolitically kind of new, right? And somewhat scary.
So this is something that Trump and people close to him have been saying for a while, that attempts to regulate and tax American tech giants in Europe will be, considered, as an attack or an attempt to undermine American interests. So it would be met with some kind of retaliation or punitive measure. That's something that Trump was saying before he came back into office. But there is just something to me which is, I'm not saying it's like funny, ha-ha, but like there is this kind of darkly humorous thing about, a congresswoman saying that there will be, sanctions and tariffs and visa revocations if European powers and the UK take steps to limit or ban or regulate a tech platform, which is currently in the news cycle because people have been using it to create images of child porn. It's a real Jeffrey Epstein, they could kill the man, but not the idea, He died in that prison, but his ideology is in power.
Let's wrap up there. My voice I've got a sore throat. I'm wondering if that, hopefully I'll be able to speak on Monday. Ash, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Always a pleasure.
You're going to need a hot ginger with a bit of honey and some lemon or lime in there, Michael. It does wonders.
Does wonders. A little bit of rum, maybe a little bit of whiskey. Make it easier to get to sleep. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Come back on Monday for another live stream at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.